I never imagined a coworker's laziness could push me this far. But when Seth, the office slacker who'd spent months dumping his work onto me, finally crossed the last line, I decided I wouldn't just fight back, I would make him destroy himself. Before I share how I turned Seth's arrogance into his downfall, tap that like button and subscribe. If you've ever been underestimated or overworked, you'll want to hear how this revenge unfolds. The first time I met Seth, he wore a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was the kind of smirk you see on someone who's already figured out how to game the system. At first, I mistook it for confidence, maybe even charm. But within a week, that grin became a warning label I'd failed to read. He slid into the office each morning like a man late to his own party, phone in hand, coffee in the other, offering half-hearted apologies to no one in particular. It wasn't just that he was late, plenty of us struggled with traffic. It was how effortlessly he turned tardiness into theater. Accident on the freeway, he'd say, even when the roads were clear. Or, had to help my neighbor catch her runaway cat. Everyone laughed politely. But I noticed the way he'd wink like it was all a private joke. Seth didn't just break rules, he made a sport of it. I'd been with the company 2 years by then, long enough to earn the trust of our small team. My work spoke for itself. Clean data analysis, airtight reports, and deadlines hit without drama. I liked the quiet rhythm of spreadsheets and problems. Seth liked shortcuts, and apparently, people like me who made shortcuts possible. It started small, an email asking if I could double-check a few numbers before a client meeting. I said yes, happy to help. Soon, help turned into handle. He'd drop a file on my desk with a grin, promising to owe me one. The first time I pointed out he hadn't done his share, he laughed. You're just faster at this stuff. Think of it as efficiency. My jaw tightened, but I let it slide. Maybe he'd catch on. Maybe he'd grow up. Instead, Seth doubled down. Bathroom breaks every 10 minutes, lunches that stretched into small vacations. He became a ghost that haunted the office only when credit was due. And every time a project turned out flawless, my projects, he'd hover near the boss's desk like a cat waiting for cream, letting praise drip over him without a word of correction. I complained once, twice. Each time, my manager frowned sympathetically, but offered the same limp response. We'll talk to him, but we need to maintain team harmony. Seth must have sensed my frustration because his smirk only grew. It wasn't just work anymore. It was a game. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning that began like any other. Gray coffee, the buzz of fluorescent lights. My inbox pinged with a message from Seth. Subject line, need a favor, urgent. He'd attached a massive report due to a client in 48 hours. No context, no completed sections, just a brief note. Could you polish this off? I'm swamped. My blood went cold. The report was easily 2 days of solid work. If I skipped lunch and stayed late, I stared at the email until the words blurred. Anger flared like a struck match. He wasn't just lazy, he was daring me to carry him again. That night, I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, my mind racing. How many hours had I spent propping him up? How many promotions, raises, or quiet nods of approval had I sacrificed to keep the team afloat while he coasted? My chest felt heavy, my jaw ached from grinding my teeth. For the first time, the thought formed sharp and clear. Enough. The next morning, Seth breezed into the office late as usual, whistling off-key, sipping a caramel latte. He dropped a cheery thanks in advance. As he passed my desk, my fingers tightened around my coffee mug. In that moment, my decision hardened like cooling steel. I wouldn't confront him. I wouldn't beg the boss again. I would let Seth bury himself while I simply handed him the shovel. I wanted to think of something clever that would feel like justice rather than petty payback. But the truth was, my mind swirled between anger and doubt for days. Every time I saw Seth slouching in his chair, scrolling on his phone with that smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, the urge to march to our boss and unload every secret boiled hot. Yet every time, I pictured my boss's polite nod, the way he would say, "We'll handle it," and nothing would change. That thought was almost worse than the injustice itself. Sleep became a thin, fragile thing. I'd lie in the dark long after midnight, the hum of the refrigerator blending with the restless pounding of my heart. Images of Seth laughing while I drowned in spreadsheets flickered behind my eyelids like cruel slides. Sometimes I'd catch myself grinding my teeth until my jaw ached, and I'd have to unclench, breathe, and whisper into the quiet, "This ends soon. It has to." Still, Doubt crept in. What if I tried something and it backfired? Seth had a way of wriggling out of trouble like smoke through a keyhole. He'd charm his way out of every reprimand before, and somehow I'd end up looking like the bitter coworker. I kept turning the question over like a coin. How do you corner a man who never takes responsibility? Every morning became a study in barely contained frustration. Seth would arrive late, as if on cue, sometimes with powdered sugar dusting his shirt from the bakery down the street. Traffic was brutal, he'd say, dropping his bag onto his desk with a thud. I'd glance at the clock 40 minutes past start time and feel my fingers curl into fists beneath the desk. He'd tap out a few meaningless emails, then vanish again for his habitual bathroom break. The office began to feel like a pressure cooker. Colleagues who once chatted freely now exchanged tired, knowing glances whenever Seth disappeared. But no one said anything. Maybe they were afraid of making waves, or maybe they'd simply resigned themselves to his antics. Either way, their silence only fed the quiet storm building inside me. Then came the tipping point disguised as a casual conversation. Over lunch one afternoon, I asked Seth if he was any good with Excel. He shrugged, a careless flick of his wrist. Not really. I mean, I can open a spreadsheet, type some numbers, but formulas, nah, that's your department. He grinned, proud of his own incompetence, and popped a chip into his mouth. My heart gave a sudden, electric jolt. I forced a neutral smile and filed the admission away like a secret weapon. That evening, as the office emptied and the city lights blinked awake beyond the windows, I lingered at my desk long after everyone had gone. The glow of my monitor bathed the room in pale blue. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, the idea forming in my mind like a slow sunrise. If Seth couldn't navigate Excel, perhaps Excel could be the trap, something subtle, invisible, something that would trip him up without a single fingerprint from me. I started small, experimenting in a blank workbook, hidden cells, nested formulas, conditional formatting, tiny, almost imperceptible mechanisms that could warp data without any obvious cause. The first attempt was clumsy. The numbers scrambled too visibly. I erased and started again, my heart quickening with a thrill I hadn't felt in months. By the third draft, the trick was elegant, a series of hidden formulas that would quietly corrupt any copied data. When I finally shut down the computer, the clock on my screen read well past midnight. I rubbed my eyes, a slow smile creeping across my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of control. Not anger, not desperation, just quiet, methodical purpose. The next day, Seth was predictably late, strolling in with a half-empty smoothie and a grin that dared anyone to challenge him. "Hey, you mind taking those spreadsheets off my plate?" he asked, already halfway toward the break room. I kept my expression neutral, fighting the urge to grin. "Sure," I said casually. "I'll get them sorted for you." He didn't even glance back. Working late that evening, I embedded my hidden formulas into the very spreadsheets Seth had handed me. Each cell looked ordinary. Each calculation appeared harmless. But beneath the surface, the numbers were primed to twist the moment someone tried to copy and paste. It was a digital minefield that only someone who truly understood Excel could detect at. As I saved the file, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. My face looked strangely calm. I expected to feel guilt, but instead there was only a quiet satisfaction, like aligning a final puzzle piece after hours of searching. Days passed, and I kept my secret. Seth continued his routine of late arrivals and long absences, completely unaware that his own arrogance was now his greatest enemy. But as the deadline for the big client report approached, a new tension wound itself around my chest. What if he somehow discovered the trap before it sprung? What if he came to me for help and I couldn't keep my expression neutral? That weekend, I barely slept. I replayed possible scenarios in my mind. Seth accusing me, the boss demanding explanations, the formulas accidentally unraveling. My own plan haunted me as much as Seth's laziness once had. I'd wanted control, but now the weight of it pressed against my ribs like a hidden stone. Monday dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that seemed to promise trouble. I arrived early, the office still hushed and cool. By the time Seth waltzed in 40 minutes late, latte in hand, I'd already arranged the spreadsheets neatly on his desk. "All set," I said evenly, as if I'd simply done my usual work. He gave me a lazy thumbs up. "Knew I could count on you." His confidence was infuriating and, in a way, delicious. He had no idea that his safety net had been quietly cut throughout the morning. I watched him from the corner of my eye as he opened the files. He barely skimmed the sheets, copying and pasting with the same careless speed he always used. My pulse quickened. The trap was live. Around noon, the first ripple of chaos reached my ears. Seth muttering curses under his breath, clicking rapidly, frowning at his screen. Weird, he said finally, loud enough for the room to hear. Numbers aren't matching up. I kept my gaze fixed on my own monitor, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. By early afternoon, his frustration had escalated to a low growl. He marched over to my desk, waving a printout like an accusation. "Hey, did you see these figures? They're all over the place. Klein's gonna kill us." His eyes were wide, a hint of panic seeping through his usual swagger. I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "That's strange. They looked fine when I checked them. Maybe it's a glitch." The word tasted sweet. Seth ran a hand through his hair, already turning back to his desk with a muttered curse. The rest of the afternoon was a symphony of his mounting desperation. The frantic clatter of keys, the occasional sharp sigh, the chair scraping back as he paced. Every time he fixed one section, another collapsed. The hidden formulas working exactly as designed. By the time the client called furious and demanding explanations, Seth was pale and sweating. He stammered through excuses, his voice cracking. I watched from across the room, my heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and vindication. Our boss emerged from his office, face tight with barely contained anger. "Seth," he barked, "my office." Now. The door closed behind them with a heavy click, leaving the rest of us in tense silence. Minutes later, muffled voices rose and fell in the boss's office first. Seth's frantic pleading, then the sharp edge of authority slicing through. The door finally swung open. Seth stumbled out, shoulders sagging, eyes wide with a kind of dazed disbelief. He didn't meet my gaze as he slumped back to his desk. For the first time since I'd known him, the smirk was gone, and in that absence, I felt the smallest, most satisfying shift inside me, a quiet recognition that the scales had begun, at last, to balance. That night, as I shut down my computer and stepped into the cool evening air, the city lights glittered like distant applause. I inhaled deeply, the weight of weeks of frustration finally beginning to lift. The game wasn't over yet. Tomorrow would bring its own reckoning, but for the first time in months, I allowed myself a slow, genuine smile. The storm I'd set in motion had finally reached Seth, and there was no shelter left for him to hide. The next morning, the office buzzed with a nervous energy that felt different from the usual midweek lull. Whispers moved from desk to desk like a low current of static. Everyone wondering what had happened behind the boss's closed door the day before. I arrived early again, partly to avoid the gossip and partly to steady myself for whatever fallout might come. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and toner, and my heart beat with a quiet, dangerous anticipation. Seth arrived late, though this time only by 10 minutes, and without the usual swagger. His shoulders sloped as if the weight of the building itself had settled across his back. The caramel latte he usually paraded through the door was missing, replaced by an empty stare and a tight jaw. He sat down without a word, his chair squeaking in the heavy silence. It was a subtle victory, but I felt it like a spark of warmth under my ribs. I kept my eyes on my own screen, but my senses were tuned to him like a radio dialed to a single station. He tapped at his keyboard in short, nervous bursts, glancing every so often toward the boss's office as if expecting the door to swing open and end his career on the spot. He wasn't the only one waiting. The entire team watched from the corners of their eyes, a shared anticipation we didn't dare voice. When the boss finally emerged mid-morning, he called a team meeting without preamble. We gathered in the small conference room, the scent of dry erase markers sharp in the air. "Yesterday's client call was unacceptable," he said, his voice low but razor-edged. His gaze swept the room before settling squarely on Seth. "Our reputation depends on accuracy and reliability. I expect everyone to take ownership of their work." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Seth swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a buoy in rough seas. "It won't happen again," he muttered, his usual smirk nowhere to be found. I almost pitied him in that moment, but I remembered the months of stolen credit, the countless hours I'd worked late while he disappeared. Pity evaporated like morning mist. After the meeting, I lingered near the coffee machine, pretending to stir cream into my mug, while watching Seth retreat to his desk. He moved with the careful caution of someone who knows the ground beneath him is cracking. It was the first time I'd seen him truly rattled, and it confirmed what I'd suspected all along. He'd never faced real consequences before. Still, my plan wasn't complete. The Excel trap had delivered the first blow, but I wanted to ensure this wasn't just a temporary stumble. Seth needed to understand that his days of hiding behind others were over. Yet, as I plotted my next move, a strange unease coiled in my chest. Was I becoming the very thing I despised? A manipulator, a schemer? That night, I wrestled with the question. I lay awake, the glow of the streetlights painting long bars of light across my ceiling. In the quiet, I replayed every moment Seth had used me. The late-night reports, the stolen credit, the dismissive winks. My jaw tightened. This wasn't vengeance for its own sake. This was balance, a reckoning. The following days revealed just how deep Seth's panic ran. He arrived on time early, but his attempts at diligence were clumsy and transparent. He asked basic questions during meetings, scribbled frantic notes, and checked his work with almost comic exaggeration. The office watched with a mix of amusement and disbelief. For the first time, Seth was actually working. I could have stopped there. A part of me considered it. After all, the shift was satisfying to witness. The predator forced into the role of prey, the once carefree slacker suddenly haunted by the possibility of failure. But then, he slipped. One afternoon, I overheard him complaining to another coworker, insisting the Excel fiasco had been a software glitch and that he'd been unfairly blamed. He laughed, a little too loud, and added, "Besides, I'll be back on top in no time." The words were like ice water down my spine. He hadn't learned a thing. All the panic, all the scrambling yet, was just a temporary mask. Give him a week, and he'd be back to his old tricks, dumping his work on anyone naive enough to accept it. My resolve hardened again. This couldn't be a single lesson. It had to be a turning point he'd never forget. I began gathering quiet evidence, not out of malice, but insurance. I saved emails where he'd pawned off his responsibilities, flagged calendar invites he'd ignored, even jotted notes about the times he'd vanished for hour-long bathroom breaks. I wasn't planning to drop the hammer right away, but if Seth ever tried to shift blame again, I wanted a record that told the truth. Meanwhile, I refined my strategy. If Excel had been the spark, the next phase needed to be the fire. But instead of another hidden trap, I chose something more subtle: exposure. I started looping our boss into every project email. Whenever Seth asked for help, I'd reply, "Sure, sing boss's name so we're all aligned." Each message was polite, professional, and unmistakably transparent. At first, Seth didn't notice. He continued forwarding tasks with his usual breezy tone, assuming I'd handle the heavy lifting. But after a few days, I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He'd glance at the CC line, then back at me, a question unspoken. I'd smile faintly and return to my work. The effect was immediate and delicious. With our boss, now aware of every handoff, Seth could no longer quietly dump his workload. He had to either complete the tasks himself or openly admit he couldn't. The safety net he'd relied on for months had vanished, and he was suddenly dangling in full view. One afternoon, he approached my desk, his voice low and tight. "Why are you looping the boss in on everything?" There was no smirk now, just a flicker of desperation. I met his gaze evenly. "Transparency," I said simply. "It's important for the team." His jaw worked as if he wanted to argue, but no words came. He turned away, shoulders stiff. Watching him squirm should have felt triumphant, and it did, but it also brought a surprising sense of calm. I wasn't lashing out anymore. I was simply holding him accountable, forcing him to stand on the ground he'd chosen. The power wasn't in any one act of sabotage. It was in refusing to be his crutch. By the end of the week, the office dynamic had shifted. Coworkers who once rolled their eyes in silent resignation began sharing knowing smiles. Seth, once the loudest voice in the room, now moved with quiet caution. The man who had thrived on getting away with everything was finally, unmistakably, on notice. That Friday evening, as I packed up my laptop and watched Seth still hunched over his desk, double-checking figures he once would have tossed aside, I felt a slow, deep satisfaction settle through me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about restoring balance to the team, to my own peace of mind. I left the office as the sun dipped low, streaking the sky with amber light. For the first time in months, I felt lighter, as if the invisible weight I'd carried had finally lifted. Behind me, Seth remained, staring at his monitor, the glow of the screen casting long, uncertain shadows across his face. The turning point had come and gone. and he didn't even realize how completely the game had changed. What he thought was just a rough patch was, in truth, the end of his old ways and the beginning of a reckoning he couldn't escape. The weeks that followed were a quiet study in unraveling. Seth, once the golden boy of the department, grew increasingly jittery. His laughter, once loud enough to carry across the office, became a rare and brittle thing. He triple-checked spreadsheets, hovered anxiously near the copier, and darted glances at the boss's door as if waiting for a summons that might seal his fate. I noticed how his designer shirts began to wrinkle at the cuffs, how the usual glint of effortless charm dulled into something close to worry. The small details told the bigger story. Late-night emails time-stamped well past midnight. Coffee rings, multiplying on his desk like the circles of a slow-spreading stain. The facade of confidence that had carried him for so long was cracking, and everyone could see it. Our colleagues, once his silent enablers, began to drift away. They no longer laughed at his careless jokes or rushed to cover his missed deadlines. Instead, they exchanged quiet nods with me, subtle acknowledgments of the shifting power. It wasn't a coup. It was a natural correction, like a forest reclaiming ground after a storm. One afternoon, the boss called a department review. He laid out performance metrics with the calm precision of someone setting a check. When he reached Seth's quarterly numbers, the room fell into a hush. Missed targets, overdue tasks. We need to see immediate improvement, the boss said, his voice flat but heavy. Otherwise, we'll need to discuss next steps. The meaning of next steps hung in the air like the cold edge of steel. Seth nodded quickly, a sharp bob of the head that betrayed the panic just beneath the surface. Understood, he murmured, but his eyes were already darting to the floor, as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. That night, long after the office lights dimmed, I stayed behind to finish a report. From the hallway, I heard the faint clatter of keys and found Seth hunched over his desk, face lit by the pale glow of his monitor. His usually perfect hair was rumpled, his tie loosened to a weary knot. He didn't notice me at first, and for a moment I simply watched this man who had once coasted on charm, now drowning in the very work he had spent months avoiding. A strange flicker of sympathy rose and fell inside me. It wasn't pity exactly, more like recognition. He was finally feeling what the rest of us had felt for so long, the crushing weight of responsibility without the cushion of someone else to blame. I almost spoke, almost offered a word of encouragement. But then I remembered the long nights I'd worked while he laughed over drinks, the promotions he'd stolen with a casual shrug. I turned and left without a sound. By the end of the month, the transformation was complete. Seth arrived early and left late, his once flawless presentations now laced with nervous caveats. He apologized awkwardly, almost shyly when asking for help, and he never again tried to hand off his work. The boss noticed, too. I could see it in the measured way he acknowledged Seth's contributions, polite, professional, but no longer indulgent. The golden boy had become just another employee, accountable, ordinary, replaceable. The real victory wasn't in his suffering but in the quiet equilibrium that settled over the team. Projects flowed smoothly, credit went where it belonged. The office, once tense with unspoken resentment, now carried a sense of balance I hadn't realized I'd been craving. One evening, as I packed my bag, Seth approached my desk. He hesitated, then said, "I just wanted to say thanks for covering for me before, and for, not making a big deal of it." His voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. There was no trace of arrogance, only the tentative humility of someone who had finally met the limits of his own luck. I studied him for a long moment. The urge to gloat flickered and faded. Instead, I simply nodded. "We all have to pull our weight," I said. He gave a small, almost sheepish smile and walked away. As the door closed behind him, a deep calm settled over me. This wasn't the fiery climax I'd once imagined. No dramatic confrontation, no shouted confessions. It was something better. The slow, inevitable shift of justice taking root. Seth had been forced to grow up, and I had learned that revenge, when tempered by patience, didn't have to be loud to be complete. I stepped into the cool night air and let the quiet city lights wash over me. The balance had been restored not by a single act of vengeance, but by a series of small, deliberate truths. And in that steady, silent reckoning, I finally found the peace I'd been chasing all along.